Yes, I'm going to talk about design codes today, past, present, and future. Only in the sense that I'm going to be talking about a number of projects. If I can get this to work, why isn't it working? There we are. I'll be talking about a number of projects structured against those three categories, past, present, and future, but not that we're going back particularly far in the past, because the first one of the project is only from 2019, so not very long ago, but reflecting on the, I suppose, 5-10 years before that. And then I'll talk about, in this first sort of category of the past, I'll talk about two recent projects that the Place Alliance did very quickly. Then a longer section talking about the present and reporting back on some research that we did recently for the ministry on their design code pilots and some of the findings. And then the final section on future will be a little bit more speculative, thinking about authority-wide design codes and a little bit of speculation on the nature of those. But let's start with the past and with the housing audit that we did 2 or 3 years ago now, 2019. It was published. Actually, I think it might even have been right at the beginning of 2020. It was published just before the pandemic hit, I seem to remember. Anyway, many of you may have come across this already. It was a project that looked at 142 large-scale housing schemes from across the country. And we evaluated each of those schemes against their design quality. And the headline from this particular research, so I'm only going to be talking about these projects as far as they relate to design codes, but just the headline from this particular project at the time was that 3/4 of how large-scale volume house building developments up and down the country were mediocre or poorly designed, so not the greatest result, if you like, for us nationally, and that of course varied regionally up and down the country. And it was an assessment that we did against these 17 factors, many of which we seem to be consistently getting wrong, and others a little bit more varied, and just a couple at the top there, which we more or less consistently are getting right. But what we were able to do, we were able to compare the findings against those 142, the assessments of those 142, against the sort of mechanisms, the tools that local authorities around the country had been using to influence design. And the finding that I just wanted to briefly mention in relation to this audit was that right at the top, in terms of the most effective tools, were design codes and design review. These came out as clearly the most effective tools when we correlated them against design quality. So respectively, almost 2.5 and 2 times more likely to be associated with good and very good rather than poor and very poor. So design codes the best, and then design reviews following that. And that also tended to reflect the regional use of those tools, particularly design codes. So, for example, Greater London, where there was the heaviest use of design review and design codes, came out as the region with the best scoring design. The East Midlands came out as the region which was struggling most on design and had the lightest use of both design codes and design review. So there seems to be a direct connection between these tools and the design quality of housing development. So that's what I really want to say about the audit. We followed that up just a little bit later on, a year or so later, with a project that was looking at design skills and capacity around England. And again, here, I just want to focus briefly on this project as it relates to design codes. But what we did is it was based on a freedom of information request that went out to local planning authorities around England, asking what was their design capacity, what were the skills available to them, to both in-house, and how did they use external skills and so forth. And again, just to sort of, the headline from this work was that skills, there was some good news that design skills didn't seem to have reduced. It didn't seem to have got the numbers of colleagues, officers with design skills hadn't reduced since the last time we did the survey, which was 2017, but they'd hardly increased either. So the bad news was that 2/5 of local authorities had no internal access to urban design skills, 2/3 no access to landscape advice, 3/4 no access to architectural advice. So a mixed picture, if you like. But specifically as it relates to design review and codes, just very briefly on design review, again, it showed a mixed picture. It showed, when we started to map out who was using design codes and design review, it showed that up and down the country, there were places where, in this case, design review was being used a lot, particularly London and parts of the southeast, other parts where it was very intermittent, and large parts of the country where design review was hardly being used at all. And there was also one other thing that we noted at the time was increasingly there was a use of external panels rather than internal panels. But on design code specifically, which is meant to be the subject of my talk today, again, like design review, there had been an increase in the amount of design codes being prepared and being used. The headline here was that 3/4 of local authorities up and down the country had at least some experience of using design codes, although only 14% were preparing those design codes in-house. And typically here, when we're talking about design codes, we're talking about site-specific design codes. So design codes related to particular site-based projects. And there was big holes in parts of the country, including some of the southeast there, just below London, where design codes are hardly being used at all. So that's just a quick look, in a sense, setting the context by looking at, I suppose both those projects were reflecting on at least the sort of 5 years, perhaps 10-year period before we did the research. And of course, as we know since then, the government have been very much driving design codes and the idea of using design codes. We had a period in the 2000s when design codes very much came to the fore of the national agenda, and there was there was a pilot program done at that time. Then they more or less went off the agenda for some time, and then they've come back on the agenda more recently. And many of you will know that the government have been funding a pilot program that's been in 2 phases, that pilot program. We were asked to monitor and evaluate the first phase of that program. There's a second larger phase going on at the moment. And this second part of my talk really just focuses on, a slightly longer part here, focuses on what were the lessons from that first phase of the pilot program. Now, the pilot program itself involved, I think it was 14 grants to a slightly larger number of authorities, because there was 1 or 2 schemes that were shared across authorities. And the types of design codes varied considerably. Some of them were focused more on authority-wide type codes, others on specific areas within a particular local authority where there are a number of development sites that potentially could be coded for. The majority were focusing on site-specific codes, so codes for specific sites. So that just to give you a context of what we were looking at. The various local authorities that were involved had a 6-month period to explore, some of them to explore the production of an actual code, but many of them looking at just particular aspects, because the pilot program, at least the first phase, was really designed to test the National Model Design Code. So not all of these authorities were, testing every single aspect. Some were focusing on particular dimensions of the National Model Design Code only. So, that's the phase 1 pilot program. Our role was to evaluate that in all its glory. As I say, some authorities were looking at particular aspects. For example, the example from Leeds at the top there, were just looking at the idea of area types and how that might work, how you divide the local authority into different areas and how you might appraise the qualities of those areas. Guildford at the bottom were looking at a particular, they already actually had a code in place in that pilot, but they were looking at overlaying the existing site-based design code with a second community-based code. And so that was quite an innovative approach, which involved a lot of engagement with the local communities in that area. But the important point to make is that all of these pilots, all of the 14, were starting from different places. They had different resources. They had different skills in-house. Some of them were commissioning external parties, consultants and others to produce codes for them. Others were doing them in-house. Some had existing design guides, others didn't. They were all starting from different places, and they were all aiming to get to to different places as well, and not all of them to produce design codes at all. So that's just to give you a sense of what we were looking at. The monitoring and evaluation itself was in 2 phases. The first phase looked at the inputs and processes, and the second phase looked at the outputs and anticipated impacts from design coding. We were only looking for 6 months, so obviously within that period, you're stretched to even produce a code, let alone actually produce any development on the ground, which is influenced by that code. So certainly the impacts were more anticipated than real. We did a whole series of interviews with all of the teams at 2 phases at the beginning and at the end, and that allowed us to draw a series of conclusions about that experience. And what I'm going to do now is just go through the results of the monitoring and evaluation, and draw out a few of the key conclusions from that work. Starting with the inputs to coding. Now, hold on a second. Yeah, so looking, as I say, at the inputs, I think we can start with 3 sort of important findings. First, that design codes were seen by all as very much a tangible demonstration of commitment to design quality, and they in turn came in the 3 types that I've been talking about, these site-specific design codes. These were very much used to optimize the responsiveness of development to local conditions and to particular character. Then there were the area-based codes, and these were used to capture multiple smaller sites in areas of a reasonably uniform character, regeneration areas and the like. And then the authority-wide design coding was seen as a means to tackle common authority-wide design problems. And most of the pilots looked to code, in fact, at the site-specific level, as you saw in that that table that I briefly flashed up, because most of them felt that that's where the real problems lay, but also because they only had 6 months, that was the sort of area that they could make most progress most rapidly. Interestingly, the pilots often disrupted the usual design code process. So design codes have typically been used and seen as vision delivery tools. That's certainly the way they were seen in the 2000s, when the Labour government at the time was exploring the idea of using design codes as vision delivery tools, being prepared following and in order typically to implement a master plan. But instead, today, what we were seeing was the preparation of design codes often in advance of an agreed site-based vision, whether that's a master plan or some other sort of framework. And the pilots were in a sense, placed in a slightly different role, in a sort of more vision-defining role rather than a vision delivery role. So that was seeing design codes in a new light and a new way of using them. And this tended to result in more strategic design codes focused on design principles rather than on detailed parameters for implementation. And it goes without saying that sorting out the resources, skills, and capacity and the organizational barriers to preparing design coding is critical. We all know about the challenges that local authorities face, and local authorities were very, very clear that to actually prepare design codes would require resources. They often didn't have those. Currently, they didn't have them in-house, and without the funding that they'd been given by the government for this particular pilot program, they often questioned whether they would be in a position to produce design codes themselves or even to commission them externally. The next two findings are self-explanatory. First, providing the necessary hooks in the local plan was seen as vital to give design codes status. So design codes were very much seen as part of a hierarchy of tools, and they needed to relate back to the local plan in particular, but also, and somehow bringing highways on board with design aspirations was seen as very much a key if coding was to be successful, although often pilots met resistance in doing this from highways authorities that was still very often in large parts of the country seem to be wedded to their own highway standards, which often weren't particularly sympathetic to placemaking aspirations. And the key here seemed to be engaging those highways authorities early on this upfront and not giving up, because some highways authorities and some of the pilots said, well, we're really not interested in engaging you with this, certainly not early on. Come back to us when you've got your code in place. But of course, by that time, it's often too late, you know. And they say they simply say, well, your code doesn't meet with our standards. So you know, for us, it's not a useful document. Moving on to the process of coding, we start with the seemingly obvious point that some places are more challenging to code and all places are complex. There's no one-size-fits-all coding process. And in this regard, the good news is that the pilot teams were generally able to successfully adapt the National Model Design Code process to their own local circumstances. The National Model Design Code is a very flexible, if you like, that it's advocating, and local authorities were able to change that according to, you know, their starting points, which, as I've said, were all different. But some locations are inherently more complex to code than others, given some delivery constraints, such as low market values and so forth. And there's certainly a need to be realistic about coding whilst remaining positive and ambitious about design quality wherever we are. Oh, I should have moved on to that slide. So some places are more challenging to code. All are complex, but we need to remain ambitious, is the point that I made. Coming to a particularly important finding, the pilots demonstrated that the use of area types is not always appropriate. Now, if you know the National Model Design Code method, then you will know that it recommends the production of area types. So this basically means dividing a local authority into areas that have some coherent character or set of qualities, and then using those areas then as a basis for coding. Now, the pilots tended to show that that is quite a time-consuming process and a complex process. And if you do it right, then In fact, what you find is that design codes, area types often overlap, and it's not straightforward. So many of the pilots in the phase one schemes found this particular aspect very challenging. They struggled with area types, and many, in fact, ended up ignoring this aspect of the National Model Design Code, in part because of the time constraints, but also because of the complexity. So even authorities planning to produce authority-wide coding tended to opt for more flexible guidance that covered their entire area and often avoided creating area types. But this should not obscure the need for character analysis, which is clearly vital when we're talking about design quality. But that needs to be conducted at an appropriate scale. And the pilots tended to find that that is more usefully conducted at the level of the site or perhaps the neighbourhood if area-wide coding is being produced. Turning to the critical input from developers, viability represents a major constraint on the mix of uses that can be supported and also the mix of housing types the market will support. And handling developer pressure on these issues was often seen as a key concern amongst the pilots. The key lesson here is that it's better to engage developers early in the coding process and in tangible ways relating to their actual investments rather than on abstract principles. So most developers not too interested in the abstract, design principles at an authority-wide scale, but very interested in what that means in terms of the site, their own particular site, of course. The next two findings relate to engaging communities, and this was very much part of the pilots that the government were keen to test, the phase one pilots. They were keen to test how design coding could relate to community engagement, and it's part of the National Model Design Code process. The pilot showed the value of early engagement with communities, but also that this is a time-consuming process, we all know that, during which trust is only gradually built with communities that, in many cases have often been intrinsically opposed to development, sometimes for many years. And so it goes beyond simply asking what people like or dislike, and at its best is very much a journey of education in both directions, from analysis to vision to coding and testing of design codes, and finding ways of engaging those communities at those different stages in the process. Over-reliance on, wait a minute, I'm going backwards. That was my problem. I was going backwards. There we are, going forwards now. So over-reliance on a single form of passive engagement tended to lead to lower response rates and to more basic, certainly less informed responses concerning community preferences. And in this respect, the pilots very often found that combining more traditional approaches to engagement, face-to-face approaches with technological means of interactive engagement around issues of genuine public interest was most fruitful. In other words, engaging the communities around what is the vision for the place rather than on the technical aspects of delivering a design code. And at the time, of course, we were still going through lockdowns and so forth, COVID-related lockdowns. So this was a sort of challenging area for the pilots to explore. But those that were able to found that you can't just totally rely on technology. Face-to-face really helps enrich the engagement and gets to different audiences than the technology. Finally, in this section, the pilots were clear that there is a hierarchy from the sort of fundamental design qualities relating to the form, layout, and use of new development that needed to be prioritized early as they impact on viability, to those that are nice to influence but can be worried about later, some of the more detailed design concerns. Some argued for a staged approach, where site-specific codes follow on from authority-wide or area-wide coding, or where detailed codes for different phases of a development build upon the principles contained in a more strategic overarching code for a larger site. So quite a few of the pilots were interested in a sort of staged coding approach and interested in exploring how that might be facilitated. Turning now to the outputs from coding, these issues span from the content of codes themselves to how they are expressed. And first, returning to the issue of area types, or at a smaller scale, character areas, to be useful, analysis needed to reflect the fine-grained complexity, variation, and constraints that characterize many urban areas. And this means that area types may often overlap, they mix, and so rather than seeing them as self-contained and bounded entities, more sophisticated approaches may be required in the future to capture the different overlapping layers of character. So you can't just sort of draw a red line around, neat red lines around different neighborhoods and expect that, the characteristics will be absolutely clear and defined within that red line boundary. These things overlap and it's complex. The picture of character is often complex on the ground. Next, another seemingly obvious point relating to the need for a balance between prescription and flexibility, depending on what is being coded in the context. So issues seen as critical, such as heights, the quantum and density of development, parking, dimensions for bin access, access for pedestrians and cyclists, all those types of things tended to be more rigidly coded, whilst more aesthetic issues were treated with greater flexibility by the pilots, particularly where variety and a creative interpretation of context was favoured as a design outcome. So the view taken on more aesthetic factors tended to vary. Some pilots wanted to have much greater flexibility, others wanted to tie those issues down more firmly. And this was reflected in the language of the coding. Local character was also seen as a fundamental concern, particularly for councillors, but I think it's far, it's difficult to say that certainly I think a lot of the pilots really struggled with the issue, particularly of beauty, and they didn't find it particularly useful beyond a sort of broad aspiration. Beauty, as we know, is an agenda that's very much being promoted, has been promoted for a while by central government, by ministers and so forth. The pilots tended not to find that a particularly useful concept. Instead, codes tended to prioritize slightly more tangible things: landscape character, density, height, issues like building line, as these were seen as some more enduring qualities of place that were easier to define and ultimately defined character as well, rather than those softer issues around beauty and so forth, and style as well. Wasn't seen necessarily as particularly a useful concept. Next, two issues that we can deal with quickly. First, it's possible to code for the desirable and rigorous design process as well as for desirable design product. For example, requirements that give development managers the confidence to ask that sites should be subject to character analysis and community engagement. Quite a few of the pilots were saying, well, we have schemes coming forward and it's very clear that the developers and the designers never even been to the site. So we need something in place to actually require that a proper analysis happens. And these process factors can be coded as well as outcome-related factors. Second, audiences benefit from digestible, readable, precisely worded, and attractive design codes, whilst containing enough detail to support decision-making without being needlessly bulked out with superfluous material. In this regard, the needs of different audiences, whether community or professional, seem to be strongly compatible. But whoever's using and reading the design code, whether it's a member of a community or a professional, they all benefit from codes that are easy to use, that are attractive, that are not needlessly bulked out with detail, which is rarely referred to. Clear language and graphic protocols tend to help readers to understand the relative importance of different elements within codes. Critical issues should be expressed as must-haves, meaning they are mandatory, while should-haves are expected rather than advisory, and could-haves are optional. So using those ways of distinguishing elements of the code can be very useful for clarity. And at the site-specific scale, must-haves can be beneficially brought together and reflected in a framework or regulatory plan to make their application and their significance crystal clear and to reduce the volume, ultimately, of codes. Finally, in this section on outcomes, communities were fundamentally concerned that codes should have real teeth. For pilots, this concerned both how they were expressed, but also how they were adopted. And adoption can occur as formal design guidance, as rather informal design guidance, or as formal supplementary planning documents or development plan documents. And with each step, of course, the status of the resulting code obviously increases, but at the expense of the time, resources, and to some extent the risk required to get through the process and the ease with which codes can later be revised. So pilot teams weighed these factors differently and took different decisions about how they wish to adopt or not their resulting design codes. Turning finally to the impact of coding, and this is anticipated impacts, as I said, because of the short period of time of the pilot program. Let's fundamentally, first it was believed that codes would give development managers the tools to become active place shapers, informed by a clear vision of design expectations. And a series of elements were often included to help with that: compliance checklists, performance targets against the code, process-related guidance. All these things were seen as helpful to encourage development managers to challenge poor schemes and to evaluate proposals in a proactive, timely, and objective fashion. But it was also clear that development managers were in need of upskilling in many of the pilots, and that a proactive role had to be taken on those issues. And in many circumstances, they will need to be assisted by those with specialist design skills, either inside or outside planning authorities, particularly in relation to those elements of design codes around which there are greater discretion in decision-making. And some of the issues that I've talked about around beauty, around aesthetics, and so forth in particular, development managers were arguing that they would need greater assistance on those issues. However, design codes were not viewed as a be-all and end-all, but that changing external circumstances and the experience of using design code should be possible to be reflected in periodic reviews of their content, particularly those at an area-wide or an authority-wide scale, which are likely to be around for a long time, in periodic reviews. And this may involve sort of formal review processes, perhaps every 2 to 5 years, or the adoption of the sort of staged approach to coding that I've already mentioned, with perhaps an authority-wide code then feeding site-specific or area-wide codes at a smaller scale. Finally, and positively, pilot teams largely proclaimed satisfaction with the tools or the processes that had been put in place during the pilot process, and with the particular, their potential, if you like, to deliver a more certain, a more streamlined and quality-focused development process. Unanimously, the 14 pilots expressed a desire to use design coding again, resources allowing. Which brings us back to where we began. The coding pilots demonstrated that there are many paths to design coding, and that design codes are not a single tool or process. These diverse ends are inevitable because there are many different beginnings, with all of the authorities all at different stages in the development of their design governance infrastructure. Positively, however, more important than the exact form design coding took was the journey that the coding teams had embarked on to get there, and the raised commitment to design quality which that represented, which they saw that represented. So I've whizzed through these findings. If you're interested in reading more about the monitoring and evaluation, then if you go to my blog, which the address there is on the screen, then you can download a blog which talks in a little bit more detail about these 21 overarching findings. And you can also find a link there to the monitoring and evaluation report, which goes into the pilots in much more detail. But what I want to do in the final part of this talk today is look a little bit to the future and apply some of those findings, some of that thinking, if you like, to the issue of authority-wide design codes. Because, as we know, in a major extension to the drive to improve design standards of new housing developments, the design standards of new housing across England, the Levelling Up and Regeneration Bill, which is currently working its way through Parliament, envisages the idea of authorities up and down the country adopting authority-wide design codes as an integral part of their development plans. Now, assuming this provision makes it into the Act, it raises, I think, several immediate questions for planning authorities up and down the country about how exactly they are going to do that. So we can draw from the experience of the pilots and the reflections that they represent on the National Model Design Code, hopefully to answer some of the key questions which I think flow from that requirement, which will be coming very soon. So the first, and a little bit more detail, is what might we mean by an authority-wide design code? I've been talking about that in relation to the pilot programme, but each of those pilots were, in a sense, exploring that themselves because there was no guidance. They each had their own definition of what they might mean by an authority-wide design code. And up until now, the term design code and design coding has tended to be associated with a sort of site-specific design codes that I've been mentioning, typically in relation to a particular planning application, often produced by developers or by their consultants rather than local authority teams or their consultants. And in 2019, design codes were defined in the National Design Guide as follows. They were defined as a set of illustrated design requirements that provide specific detailed parameters for the physical development of a site or area. So this is just a couple of years ago. There was no mention of authority-wide design codes at that stage. It was very much about the site or the area. it notes that the graphic and written components of the code should build upon a design vision such as a master plan or other design and development framework for a site or area. And so that definition clearly envisages codes related to particular sites or closely defined areas, such as a neighborhood with a number of developable sites, and as a delivery tool for a spatial vision that had already been prepared. Now, this contrasts, I think, with the simpler and broader description contained in the National Model Design Code, which characterizes design codes as a set of simple, concise, illustrated design requirements that are visual and numerical wherever possible to provide specific detail parameters for the physical development of a site or area. And for the first time, the area in question is specifically enlarged to everything from the neighborhood, from an individual site to neighborhoods, up indeed to a whole county potentially, if the authority is representing a county. So this fundamentally changes the nature of design codes, because first they're being prepared for very large territories with very varied characteristics that might potentially encompass everything from high density town centres to low density suburbs and even rural areas. And second, they will need to be prepared in the absence of a spatial design vision, becoming in effect those vision defining rather than vision delivery tools. Now, I mentioned when I was talking about the results of the pilots that this is the position that many of the pilots had in effect been put in, because they didn't have a master plan or they didn't have a clear vision. So they were having to produce a code, sometimes at the authority-wide scale, sometimes at the area scale, sometimes at a site-specific scale, without that pre-existing vision. So this puts codes in a different position than we have traditionally seen them. To put this another way, rather than the content of master plans for sites subsequently informing and being delivered through codes, those master plans would themselves be increasingly shaped by codes. And this is something the pilots, as I said, explored, as a good proportion of the codes were being created in the absence of a strong pre-existing vision for an area, for the area being coded at whatever scale that happened to be. And this led to codes that were less detailed, more strategic in scope, setting out only those critical design parameters related to factors such as development form, mixed density, greenness, connections, rather than every architectural or public realm aspiration or detail, factors which perhaps arguably, and in the experience of many of the pilots, could be left until later to the site-specific level. So the new authority-wide codes might, if you like, take a leaf out of this book, and rather than attempting to be all-encompassing from the start, trying to code absolutely everything, they might focus on those more strategic design parameters. And indeed, the bill itself, the bill that's working its way through Parliament, notes that authority-wide coding does not need to cover every aspect of design or every design implications or every possible type of development in every location. So the notes to the bill have that advice within them, which I think is important advice. Moving on to a second question, how are authority-wide codes different from previous design standards and guides? The proposed legislation offers little detail with regard to the nature of new codes and only specifies that for every part of their area, the development plan includes requirements with respect to design that relate to development. Now, on the face of it, every authority already in some ways complies with this requirement, given that all have at least some basic policy or guidance in place or on design, even if that hasn't proved particularly effective in the past. However, up in the ante, authorities will now be expected to specify in their local plan timetable how they will comply with this provision within the forthcoming Act. And in fact, in a related clause to the bill, the Secretary of State reserves the right to intervene where a local authority fails to ensure design code. An interesting expression, fails to ensure design code. So authorities will need to be careful, they need to carefully consider what they have already in place and whether that cuts the mustard as regard whether it is an effective design code or not. They should also bear in mind the clear expectation is for authorities to put in place a more effective regime of urban design governance than many have had in the past. So the chances are what most currently have in place won't cut the mustard. The National Model Design Code distinguishes between design guides, in other words, more generic and flexible sort of guidance, and design codes as more specific and prescriptive. We also need to distinguish between harmful codes in placemaking terms and those that will deliver, better quality design outcomes. Also between effective and ineffective tools of planning that we've used in the past. So on this front, authority-wide coding of sorts, of course, is nothing new, but the types of standards and guidance that we've had so far have not produced great results. On the one hand, we have the ubiquitous design standards, like those on the screen, very small, you probably can't read it, but that's to represent highways design standards. Now, these have been very effective at delivering on their objectives, namely highways-dominated developments, but pretty poor at delivering any place quality. On the other hand, we have the equally ubiquitous generic design policies in local plans and almost as widespread residential design guides that are respectively often so open to interpretation and so detailed that despite their focus on place quality, they are just as easily ignored as used. So the impacts of these substandard codes are often plain to see around the country in rather poor or mediocre quality housing schemes, the sorts of schemes that dominated in the housing audit that I talked about at the beginning. So how will the new design codes be different from these? Well, the aspiration should be to combine the prescriptive, I don't know, what's my, there you are. The aspiration should be to combine the prescriptive non-negotiable qualities of highway standards with the authority-wide precision or the authority-wide sort of statutory position, I should say, in the planning process of design policy in the local plan, and the place quality focus of local design guides. So if we can get those three things working together some way, the prescriptive non-negotiable nature of highway standards, the status, the statutory status of policy in the local plan, and the place focus of the sort of local design guides that many authorities have, then we are potentially onto a winner. This, of course, is not easy to do. And when this was the focus of the pilots, the monitoring and evaluation revealed that codes can be prepared surprisingly rapidly, but trying to balance these different objectives, the must-have qualities with the issues which can be negotiated later, was a very, very difficult thing to do. Now, So local planning authorities up and down the country certainly will be grappling with an additional question: where to start with this. But as the pilot showed, as we're all in different places as regards the existing urban design governance capabilities, each will be on their own journey, and on a different journey, often to authority-wide design coding. So the best advice here, I think, is to start from where you already are and build from there. And I think this is because authorities will already have a good sense of which aspects of design are being successfully implemented locally and which aspects are not, what form their current suite of policies and guidance is, or what rather from their current suite of policies and guidance is proven effective at the delivering design quality and what is not. And at the same time, if the ambition is to raise standards nationally, then this is only a sort of stepping off point and not the end of the journey. We'll need to start by challenging, in a sense, what has gone before. And to do this, it will be necessary to start by understanding what we have, start by going out, looking, experiencing and critiquing recent developments. A huge amount can be learned by both quickly and effectively through post-completion analysis, but often that doesn't happen because of pressures of time and so forth. Also, meaningfully engaging local citizens in this process, both of looking but also asking about design aspirations in a manner that goes beyond simplistic likes and dislikes to aspirations for good places that will allow in each locality fulfilling and hopefully enriching and sustainable lives to be led, and engaging with other critical parties early in these conversations, notably those highway authorities. And here, as I mentioned, persistence is required, but also local developers and perhaps neighbouring authorities as well. So while every authority will be unique, many will share qualities and challenges in common, as well as often a lack of resources. And it may be that by working together, they can get a long way forward in preparing an authority-wide design code that can be shared in whole or part, or simply in terms of the thinking process that feeds into its production. And the monitoring and evaluation revealed a lot of excellent work in the first and second of these concerns, although the third, sharing between authorities, was often underexploited, at least within the confines of the testing period. Now, the National Model Design Method also raises another starting point, and that's the identification of those area types, areas of unified character, and their analysis as a basis for then developing more locally specific coding. Now, while this is undoubtedly a valuable exercise and capable of producing more locally responsive design codes, in particular in relation to factors such as landscape and architectural character, it's also complex and time-consuming, as the pilots revealed. An alternative may be to begin simply by using the approaches already outlined to identify the sort of critical and generic what goes wrong factors, such as the example on the screen, the things that we shouldn't be doing, and then gradually differentiating and nuancing these over time for different areas within local authorities. So if authority-wide design codes are here to stay, the first iteration of those authority-wide codes is unlikely to be the last, and it may be more important to get the fundamentals in place rapidly, adding the specifics at a later date. And this was an approach that was adopted by quite a number of the authorities that we monitored during the first phase of the pilots. And the second round of the pilots will be looking at this further and how area types can or can't be used. Coming to my final question, if written well, and by which I mean that they should be clear, focused, graphic, and measurable, then authority-wide design codes should be the first port of call once they're produced for designers, for developers, for development managers and councillors, and indeed for planning inspectors and communities when they seek to understand any development proposition in their localities. And to do this, they will need to be intuitive to use, they will need to be attractive, they will need to be engaging, and they will need to be no longer than they absolutely need to be. Now, over time, we'll be able to gauge how effective these new forms of codes are. As already argued, they will need to be quite different from the sorts of authority-wide policy and guidance and standards that we've used up to now. And we shouldn't underestimate that this is not or should not be an exercise in repackaging those standards and policy, but it actually needs a sort of fundamental relook at those tools that we've been using up to now. And the monitoring and evaluation suggested that in recognizing and helping to tackle authority-wide design problems, authority-wide codes will be valuable in the absence of the capability to take a site-specific approach, but can also help to coordinate area-based and site-specific codes. And to my mind, the real prize remains those site-specific design codes that have proven to be so effective, and that the housing design audit showed to be particularly effective tools of urban design governance. These have proved particularly effective at delivering design quality in the past, largely because their preparation requires a careful site-specific design process. In other words, they are site-based tools requiring a site-based design process rather than a generic tool for a whole local authority. Typically, this will involve an urban designer or architect directly engaging with the place rather than a plansmith simply applying generic housing products and generic codes to a particular site. And in fact, the explanatory notes of the new bill confirm that authority-wide codes can act as a framework for those site and area-specific design codes. Sorry, I'm struggling a little bit here with my computer. It's doing all sorts of strange things. And so this should be made explicit by authorities when drafting their new authority-wide design codes by including a simple requirement that a site-specific design code be prepared for every major housing application, building on or delivering the provisions in any authority-wide design code. In other words, the authority-wide design code should provide the framework, but the site-specific design codes are the real prize. Those are the ones that are really going to deliver the design quality. So, to conclude, the making of authority-wide design codes mandatory is, I think, a bold and welcome move. But as with so much in our planning system, how that is interpreted locally will be different. Every authority will interpret it very widely and differently. And that, of course, is local democracy, is a good thing. But it's also reflective of local resources and the confidence that varies locally to do the work. As the monitoring and evaluation report concluded, it's difficult to underestimate the vehemence with which the pilot teams drove home the message that to move beyond the usual process of waiting until developers are in place, then being led by them, requires that authorities have access to design skills and capacity. Clearly, we will need to get full coverage of design codes quickly, and it may take many years. But if written well and then kept under review and then refined as evidence of implementation begins to mount, we could be moving into a new and much more effective era in the long but often rocky history of urban design governance in England. So thank you very much for listening to me. If you want to learn more about any of those projects that I've mentioned, then as I say, if you go to my blog, then you can access the reports and often blogs on the different reports there, and get access also to the Place Alliance. Let me stop sharing my screen and see if there are any questions. I was rather fighting with the technology all the way through that. I hope you didn't notice too much, but it kept on doing all sorts of strange things on my computer. Anyway, there we go.
Well done, Matthew. That was, I think, brilliant. And I really like the fact that we had you being able to talk for the best part of an hour and really develop it, rather than us shoehorning you into a 10-minute slot with 3 other people also giving 10-minute slots. I'd be really interested to hear what other people think, not only about what you've said, but about that format. So questions now beginning to come in the chat. We have been going for a while, and so what Maura has done is pop the poll, please, on your screens, just as a little bit of a break. If you could do that, just a bit of information about who's done codes and who hasn't done codes and so forth. I'm reluctant to say that the agenda said we take a short break before coming back, but we've only got 20 minutes left on the session. By the time we've taken a 5-minute break, I'm concerned that people will just, frankly, have a bit of a longer time to make a cup of coffee and not come back. So I suggest we just carry on with questions now and perhaps finish 5 minutes earlier. So we have Nico has put in the chat suggestion about best guidance for producing site-specific codes. Nico, are you on the call? Yes, you are. Would you like to unmute?
Hi, Penelope. Yes, I am on the call, and I'm here.
Excellent.
And,
do ask your question for real.
The presentation was great, Matthew, and I really enjoyed it, and it all made sense. And I think we should spread the message. Just because I'm starting tomorrow a series of workshops with the developers on an urban extension for a design code that has been applied as a condition by the Secretary of State on an allowed appeal for that urban extension. I just wonder whether you have any suggestions also for, I suppose, site-specific or area-specific design codes that I can look at before I start my series of workshops with the developers and stakeholders tomorrow.
So if you want guidance on how to prepare site-specific design codes, then I would say the best guidance still is the guidance produced in the 2000s, the last time government was interested in design codes, because there the focus was very much on site-specific design codes, and there was a good practice guide produced. Now, I think it's called Preparing Design Codes. I should know because I wrote it, but I think it's still available via the government website. Although you might be, if you go to my blog, that website I gave you, and go to, I think, at the top, there's a thing that says guides and stuff. You should be able to download it from there as well. And also the research that fed into that, Preparing Design Codes, it's called. I think that's still the best guidance, the most comprehensive guidance for site-specific design codes.
That's very helpful. That's fine. I shall do so. Thank you.
So we have Rebecca Jarrett. Are you on the call? Because you've popped a question in the chat. Would you like to put?
I am. Yes.
Pop your mic
Hi.
on.
Can you hear me?
Yeah. Carry on.
So my question is, do you think there is any value in the developer-led site-specific design coding that tends to be more practice currently? And do you think perhaps having a local authority-wide design code that's got like a process for producing that might improve the quality of those?
Yeah, I think the majority of design codes that have been produced in the country over the last 20 years are developer-led, because most local authorities, not all, but most local authorities don't have the capacity to produce those site-specific design codes in-house. A few do, but the most don't. So they're relying either on commissioning consultants themselves, which they sometimes do, but more often they rely on developers to commission consultants to produce codes. And then those codes are obviously part of the planning application. It comes forward. Now, the audit showed that they are effective tools. Now, that's not to suggest that every single design code produced by a developer is wonderful. Some I know are not. Some have been watered down to such a degree that they're basically useless. I think it's about the local authority working with the developer to ensure that the design code that is produced is one that they can both agree on and are both happy with, and that there is some mechanism in place to ensure that then it's subsequently delivered. So if you go through that process, then site-specific design codes are very effective tools at delivering design quality. But you're absolutely right that if we're in the future moving to a situation where we have authority-wide design codes, then I would say one of the provisions in those authority-wide codes is, how are these principles going to relate to specific sites? And the best way to do that is to then have that second stage of coding at the site-specific level. So a requirement in the authority-wide code that a site-specific code is produced. So this is what I mean by this staged approach to coding, so that we don't just abandon site-specific codes because we have authority-wide ones, because those inevitably will be more generic.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Matthew. We've had 32 of the 55 of you answering the poll. I'll leave it up a bit longer just to see if more of you can give it a shot. I'm interested particularly in the last question about how confident you are about using the MPPF as a reason for refusal. And so far we have a balanced response, with as many people not being confident as being confident, but most people sitting on the fence, which is not actually a surprise to me. Anyway, let's have another, keep going on that one while we see if Peter Nixon, are you on the call? Because you've put a question in the chat.
I am, yes. Hello. Hello, Matthew.
Hello.
I used to enjoy your lectures about 10 years ago now at the Bartlett, and you've barely changed. Anyway, can you code for variety and ensuring that there's not a repetitive, use of 2 or 3 housing types in a major scheme? Is that something that's possible? Is it something that's been tried or tested?
Yes, no, absolutely. I think depending on where you are, some sites require a greater variety than others, depending on what the overall vision is, what the concept is. Some require a greater degree of unity between housing types and styles and so forth. So I think it's about defining your vision, and then determining to what extent is variety in housing types part and parcel of that vision. And then absolutely it's something that can be coded for and is coded for in many design codes. So if you go to a code like the design code for Eddington in Cambridge, I think that I'm trying to remember off the top of my head whether it has provisions of variety, but I think it does. You might go, look there, and I think a lot of the most sophisticated codes have such provisions within them.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
So there are no other questions in the chat. No one else has put their hand up. So just while we're seeing if anyone else wants to pop a question to you, Matthew, I thought I'd reflect on your phrase vision defining and vision delivery. I found that extremely helpful. It's amazing how short little slogans like that can crystallize fluffy thoughts in the head. And of course, vision delivery is what a local plan's meant to do, and vision delivery is what a DM is meant to do. So I found that very helpful, and I hadn't sort of thought of it this way, but an area-wide design code is effectively planning policy. It's just not being done through an SPD or a DPD. Thoughts about that? How does it fit in the system? What weight would it have?
Well, I think the idea that the current bill, the Future Act, is putting into place is that the authority-wide code will be formally part of the local plan. So it will be formally adopted in that sense, and will have the same status as the rest of the plan. So that does mean it very much comes, or should come, up front in the process. It should be there, and then that should then inform what subsequently happens on key sites and so forth over time. And in that sense, it is it is about delivery, but it's also about defining, what is the vision for the place? What are the aspirations that are going to be delivered? As opposed to the way that we've used design codes in the past, where somebody has produced a master plan and the code has effectively been the tool to ensure that is delivered. So it's a slightly different type of tool.
Yeah.
And in a way, personally, if I was government, I would have not used the same term for all of these different things. I would have used different terms, and I think that might have been a little bit more straightforward, because we're trying to stretch this idea of design codes over a lot of different things. But nevertheless, we are where we are, and it seems to be the term of the moment. So, but we just have to think about it in different ways, I think. Yeah,
that's really helpful. And there was something else that I got it popped into my head, and as soon as I looked at my notes, it's popped out of my head again. I will start. Thankfully, Jill Butter has got me out of my problem, because she's put a question in the chat. Thank you, Jill. Would you like to put your mic on and ask your question?
Hi. Yes. My question to Matthew is there not a danger that in seeking to code everything, that we end up with a lack of, it follows on from Peter's comment, but really to say that we lose the delight of the serendipitous, which can happen and can create the delight of place. And I just worry that by coding everything, we just going to, it becomes too rigorous.
Yeah, I think that's a very interesting point. I think that we have to be mindful of, how far we should go with coding. If we try and tie absolutely everything down, then we will result in, first of all, we need to be extremely confident that actually what we're coding is what we really want, because that's what we'll get. But secondly, we have to be, everything is going to be very similar, and that chance, that experimentation, potentially we can lose some of that. Now, to a certain extent, when we think about the way that cities, towns, and so forth were developed in the past, there was a code, there was an unwritten code already in place, the code around the use of local materials, because those were used because they were local, and that's all there was, sort of thing. The code around how high we could build, or how the size of glazing, and so there was lots of things that were sort of coded almost by accident. The width of streets and so forth were sort of coded because there was established practice, and a cart was so wide, and 2 to pass was so wide, and so we've had codes. We've always had codes in a sense, and then we started to change those. We started to change those codes into very prescriptive things around highways and so forth, and we used other ways of measuring what was a good code and what wasn't, and we often went astray. We produced places very dominated by tarmac and vehicles and parking and so forth, and not particularly good places for walking, but nevertheless they were using codes. So we've always had codes. It's about how in the future we can change from these very crude codes that we've had in the last 50 years to ones that are going to be producing the sustainable, high quality places that frankly we deserve.
So can I put that in a slightly different way, Matthew, and say it's moving away from specialist codes that deal with a particular aspect, distance of bins from bin lorries, highway widths and so forth, to something that's an integrated place shaping code?
Absolutely. That's a very good way of putting it.
It's having that vision. Sorry, Penelope, but it's having that vision, isn't it? And it's understanding what you want.
Right.
I think that's your point of knowing what you want. And I think that's always the difficulty. It's getting in at the right point of knowing what you want and how you can achieve it through the coding, which I think is where people find it, even professionals find that quite difficult.
Yeah. And I think one of the things I'm not particularly keen on is the language of the must and the should, because I think in our heads, actually must and should are quite conflated terms. I prefer require and recommend. And if you actually then you have your list of possible things that you might code, and you then go, oh, I require this. Do I really require this? Or do I only recommend it? You sort of you can sort
Yeah,
your goats. And we're not saying every code has to code everything. This is a point that Matthew made. So there are things that can still be left to serendipity, because all those things you can leave to personal choice, but perhaps it's just the core things about fenestration, rhythm, or building height that you might want to put in the code. Sorry, Matthew.
Yeah, no, there was a lot of discussion about this in the first round of the pilots, and eventually the wording that most of them agreed on was could, should, and no, must, should, and could. Yeah, so could is what you were saying, is those things that you don't, that are nice to have, but it's not the end of the world, and actually it's nice for some innovation and so forth as well. Should are expectations. They're things that you would expect in most circumstances, but you're open to a developer making a particular argument. And obviously the musts are things that are non-negotiable. So it was that sort of three-part sort of approach.
Bibi, do you want to ask your question? Are you there? Let's see if we can move on to C power. I wonder if that's Charles. Charles, are you there? Would you like to put your mic on and ask the question you put in the chat? We'll come back to Bibi in a minute. Yes, it is Charles. Hello, Charles. You're on mute. He knows he's on mute. Oh, shall I? Okay, so he's I think some body language, I'll read it for him. Is authority-wide coding going to result in any arguments over household extension not complying with the code and result in a considerable amount of work to check against the code on applications that the code really was not set up for?
I'm now working.
Oh, too late.
Yeah, story of my life. Hello, Penelope.
Matthew, does that make sense to you, or do you want Charles to elaborate?
So let me just read it again. Is authority-wide coding going to result in any arguments over household extension not complying with the code and result in a considerable amount of work to check against the code? Household, so you're talking about very small applications for household extensions and so forth, and whether those would be covered in an authority-wide code?
Basically, yeah. I'm just worried that you know how vociferous some people get when their neighbour is doing something that they don't like. And I can just see them waiving the authority-wide code, saying, this doesn't comply with this aspect of the code and this aspect of the code and this aspect of the code, and us having to check all those things every single time a householder came in. And I'm sure that we can set up codes that say these don't relate to householder applications. Is it just as simple as saying that in your code and that's the end of the of worrying about it?
Yeah, I think most authorities already have guidance on what is permissible and what is not, and for things that are not, often authorities will have guidance about, if you need to apply for planning permission, then these are the sorts of things we'll be looking for. Whether those are included in authority-wide design code, I think they probably would be. Most of the work that has been done up to now, I think, has tended to focus on the bigger scale issues to do with the larger projects. But I think there's no reason why the householder stuff shouldn't also be included in the design code. Interestingly, the bill going through Parliament is also including this provision for street votes. So this is allowing streets to decide, well, actually, collectively, we want to be able to do this, this, and this, build an extra 2 stories, build out in this way and that way, and to vote on it, and then for that to be part of their permitted development rights. How much of that will happen in the future, I have no idea. It seems a rather clunky mechanism to me, but there we are.
Yeah, well, where does the street start and where does the street finish, and who gets to vote? Yeah.
Well, indeed. And on that point, I'm going to read Bibi's question for her because she's got sound problems. She says, design codes, any comments, please, on environmental issues such as trees, biodiversity, flooding, etc.?
Well, all those issues should certainly be
the last question.
Yeah, all those issues should certainly be incorporated within the codes. in the pilots, they range from very urban authorities to very rural authorities. Obviously, those sorts of issues were particularly prominent in the rural authorities that were very concerned about environmental issues, integration of development with the landscape and so forth. And they formed quite a major part of their deliberations, but important everywhere, of course, and certainly a critical part of coding.
So thank you very much, Matthew. Let's just have a look at the results of the poll. Maura, if you can do whatever it is that you need to do to share the poll, or is it does everyone get to see the results anyway on the screen as we go? I never quite know how these things work. If I go stop sharing on here, does it take it away or does it show it with everyone?
I think it takes it away. So
Okay.
I think you just need to read what you can see.
Okay, so we've got question 1, is your authority preparing a design code? Roughly 50-50 of the people that replied. 20% haven't answered, but the rest are about equal. Have you been involved with preparing a design code? On this call, 40% have, 60% haven't. Have you been involved in applying a local design code? 30% have, 65% haven't, and 5% say they are in the process of doing it. So that's interesting. Have you used any of the National Model Design Codes or the National Design Code in assessing planning applications? Interestingly, only a third say yes, but of course that may be because that third is the DM third on the call and the rest are policy people, so of course it wouldn't apply. And I'm confident about using the MPPF as a reason for refusal. Most people are okay with that. 26% are confident or very confident, and about 24% are not confident. So actually that's a really good spread. I was slightly concerned that that might suggest that people were less confident, but that's not doing too badly. So there's quite a wide experience, but there's still a lot of learning to go. So, I've now got share results popping up. Oh, I don't know. I'm going to get rid of this. I must test that another time and find out how this really works.
On that last question around the MPPF, there was too many P's in there. MPPF. We produced a report early on in the year around the appeals process, and that really showed that people should be confident. They should be using the MPPF. Yeah. As if design is not meeting your aspirations, then reject it. And more often than not, it seems that it's being supported at appeal by inspectors.
Yeah, good. Thank you. That's a very, very good note on which to end. So thank you very much, Matthew. Really great to have you with us. Excellent to be able to give you the time to expand on all that research that you've been doing, because most of us are just so close to doing the day job, we never have a chance to open Planning Magazine, let alone read it. So really good. I'm hoping that everyone else agrees. If you think it was good, do put a clap in the chat if you can. I mean, a clap reaction. One person's managed to clap, 2 people, excellent. Quite a few claps. Thank you very much, Matthew. And thank you all to you for coming, and hopefully see you on future Bob MK webinars, and not so far away, 6 months away, summer site visits. There's a scary thought, isn't it? All right, thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks very much, Matthew.
Thanks a lot. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.
I've just had a thought, Maura. What we need to do is you end the meeting and then we jump back on the link for a quick catch up.
Okay.